Good morning, Artificial Hearts family. It's a privilege for us to be here. We are straight in the heart of the Amazon, in Belém do Pará, in Brazil. And I have with me here two special guests all the way from the U.S., James Standish, David Little. I want to say welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much.
Yes. And I just also want to give out a warm welcome to our fans in Brazil. So I'm just going to give a little brief message in Portuguese. Bom dia, pessoal aqui do Brasil. A gente quer agradecer vocês pela presença. Queremos agradecer os Adventistas Norte sobre a presença do diretor de comunicação, Heron Santana, que fez essa live, essa parceria com o Artificial Hearts e a União Norte Brasileira possível para a gente gravar esse podcast sobre liberdade religiosa. E vamos agora voltar para inglês. So it's a privilege to have you here in this partnership on the podcast. And I wanted for you two to please introduce yourselves to our audience here in Brazil and that's also going to be watching in the United States. Why are we here? Well, what is the event that we're participating? A lot of people are wondering. And if James, if you want to start, and then also David, tell a little bit more about what we're doing here.
Sure, just very briefly, my name's James Standish. I'm a lawyer who's worked in the area of religious freedom for some years. I've worked both for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the global headquarters of the Adventist Church, but also for the U.S. government. And now I have my own firm, and I handle a variety of clients. Sometimes I work on religious freedom issues, sometimes more broadly on human rights and aid and development issues. I'm here because I was invited to come to be part of a pre-G20 meeting that looks at religious freedom, particularly in the context of communal and minority rights. Brazil, just like every country I've ever lived in, I've lived in a few because I grew up in Asia and I'm from Australia originally, and of course I live in the U.S. now, has complex relationships between the majority populations and the indigenous minority populations, and how those rights intersect can be very complicated and can also result in tremendous damage, particularly to indigenous communities, and we've seen that in a number of contexts, and so that's what we're here to talk about.
And tell us about the G20 for maybe our viewers that don't know what that is.
Well,
and introduce yourself first.
Yeah, okay. I'm David Little. Very pleased to be here. I have an academic and a governmental background. For many years, I've taught at various schools in the fields of religious studies, human rights, religious nationalism is a particular interest of mine. But I've also worked for the U.S. government. I was 10 years at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., where we conducted a 10-year study, really, of the subject of religious nationalism. We were particularly interested in the contribution of legislation, laws, policies in favor of religious freedom and the effect of those on whether the form of nationalism takes what we might call a liberal form, an open-minded, open-hearted form, or whether it takes a more narrow, short-sighted, destructive form. We studied places like Sri Lanka, Sudan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq, and so on, and came to the conclusion that in general it's pretty easy to demonstrate that those countries that accentuate the importance of religious freedom, its protection legally, contribute generally to the reduction of violence, a reduction of oppression, and those countries that are in the opposite direction, that encourage religious nationalism, xenophobia, and so on, work to the detriment of the creation of peace, create destructive capabilities, and so on.
And I think our viewers are probably wondering, how did you two get involved with your work with religious freedom? I know both of you have extensive work, whether a firm working in the government, but tell us maybe just briefly, how did your journey as a religious liberty advocate, as somebody who defends these principles, how did that begin, and how did it take you to these experiences working with governments and firms? James.
Well, I began when I was in law school. I went to Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C., and I started a organization called the Church State Law Forum. It was an official student-run organization at the law school. We hosted a major national conference on something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act on the state level. We had professors come in from a variety of places around the country, and I started writing. So I wrote some articles about it, about religious freedom issues that were current at the time. But when I finished law school, I had debt, because that's a very common thing when you go to school. So I went and worked for a big law firm, not doing anything in religious freedom, although I did handle some pro bono cases that involved asylum cases, but that's an aside. But after I'd paid off my student debt, I was approached by the Adventist Church to come and help with their government relations in Washington, D.C. It wasn't something that I was expecting, but I was praying at the time, and I wanted to do something in this area. It was an area of passion for me. And, God, I'm a great believer. God answers prayers, not always the way that we expect them or when we expect them, but in time. And that's how I became involved and have remained involved in one way or another subsequent.
I suppose the beginnings of my interest in the subject took place in college. I went to a Presbyterian school called the College of Worcester in Ohio. That was at that time a fairly strict Presbyterian school, and professors who came there had to espouse a kind of evangelical oath of loyalty. And I was majoring in philosophy and was in the class of one philosopher professor who had signed the pledge, but over the summer had in effect lost his faith, and he was fired from the college. This seemed to me unjust and unwise. And as a matter of fact, I wrote to Reinhold Niebuhr, whom you mentioned in your, and asked him whether my defense of this fellow and the right of free conscience and the need to protect against the use of punishment, coercion in matters of conscience was justified. And he wrote back affirming that my position. I was called into the president's office and in a very agitated session was rebuked for sharing our dirty linen in public. But I think that was the beginning of my interest in this subject. I went on to seminary and graduate school, always with a focus on this problem, and of course worked then at the Institute of Peace, which carried that further.
Both of you have, thank you for that. And maybe just for those of you who don't know, Reinhold Niebuhr, very famous U.S. Theologian from the 20th century that had a very important impact, right, in these questions of freedom and justice. And both of you have a vast experience working with religious liberty in the international context. What were some of the challenges that you can tell, or experiences that you see that individuals struggle with in religious liberties across the globe, and how did that enhance or teach you more about the importance of religious liberty? Dave, you want to?
Well, I would simply go back to my experience at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I saw, I think in graphic detail, the importance of the protection of religious freedom and the direct connection between the lack of religious freedom and its protection and resort to violence. It's fairly easily empirically demonstrable that the more freedom there is, the less likelihood that there will be oppression, domination, and so on. And these experiences that I had in the different countries I mentioned accentuated that in great detail.
Yeah, I would agree with David. I've worked on a number of individual cases. Particularly, I've dealt with an Iranian convert to Christianity who was about to be deported from Turkey back to Iran, where he faced the death penalty, trying to get him out of the situation he was in, and was able to get him out of that with the help of a member of the European Parliament from Ireland, actually. It turned out a Catholic member of parliament who was sympathetic to the religious freedom claims. I've met with religious folks who are in prison in Vietnam. I've been to the very far reaches of India where Christians, and met the widows of people women who had, whose husbands had been killed in anti-Christian violence by Hindu extremists. What you find is that people who sometimes opine about religious freedom being either an unnecessary right, or even there are some people whose ideas of prophecy that, well, there's going to be persecution, so why would we fight against it? They're not the people who've been persecuted. When you look at somebody in their face and see a woman who's lost her husband and her breadwinner and has children whose husband has been murdered on the streets because he's a Christian or because he's a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever it is, because I've met people from a variety of different backgrounds who've gone through these horrible, horrible experiences, then you realize this isn't just some intellectual right. This is an absolutely core human right that we have to stand for and fight for, and it's not an easy battle, I'll tell you that much, because I've worked with the government of Iran, I've worked with the government of Turkmenistan, as I've said, communist nations as well. It's a tough battle out there, and it's never won, that's for sure.
And David, I think it's always good, and this is your specialty on the history of religious freedom, I think it's always good reminding our society why this right is something that is so valuable. And I wanted you maybe just to tell us a little bit, how does this right develop? I think the traditional narrative has been that these ideas of natural rights, religious freedom, and separation of church and state are just a product of the Enlightenment. But in your research, what has been maybe the contribution from your own religious community, from Calvinism, Presbyterianism, to the development of this modern right that we have?
Yes, that the point you make is very important. It's, I think, a general academic understanding and probably a popular understanding that the whole idea of rights and the protection of individual opportunities is based in the Enlightenment, 18th century period. But actually, I and a number of other people have discovered that the idea of individual rights, particularly the right of freedom of conscience, goes back well, certainly to the early Middle Ages, and probably well before that. And I think it's not that surprising that the idea shows up, since there does seem to be a fundamental conflict between coercion and conscience. Conscientious beliefs are matters of free inquiry, opportunity to make decisions of one's own, to explore as one will. And when you have a government coming in, or the law coming in and telling you you may not think that, you must think this, that obviously destroys the very heart of what the conscience is all about. And therefore it's not surprising, as I have found, that certainly in the Middle Ages, with the so-called conciliar movement, which was in opposition to the monarchy of the Pope, it wanted a more pluralistic form of government based upon the rights of citizens to contribute to both their government and the laws and the church and so on. And that conciliar tradition influenced John Calvin, a person whom I've been very interested in, and that Calvinist tradition generates again and again an emphasis on those particular protections. I must say that the Calvinist tradition, since I brought it up, is somewhat ambivalent. John Calvin is not well known as a hero of religious freedom, but in his early days, he does advocate the right of individuals to express themselves. He favors having Jews and pagans, as he calls them, and Muslims as well as Christians in the government. It is true that when he assumes power in Geneva, he rather goes back on that particular position. But interestingly, and I'll finish with this, one of his disciples, and he is a disciple, Roger Williams, the founder, Roger Williams picks up on this early Calvinist emphasis on the freedom of conscience from oppression by the government, and really founds the Rhode Island colony in 1636 based upon those very principles. So the early Calvinist influence on the shape of the rights of conscience to free expression is well in anticipation of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment enriches and carries it forward in some ways, but the the sources of this inspiration are deep within at least certain parts of the Christian tradition.
Yeah. And maybe just to go on from there, sometimes people say religious freedom, or concepts of religious freedom, are uniquely Western, and it's almost a form of cultural imperialism to talk about universal rights. And my response to that is very simple, and that is, if you go around the world, no matter where you are, people want to be able to believe and practice their faith according to the dictates of their hearts. It doesn't matter if you're Asian. I grew up in Asia. I saw it there. It doesn't matter if you're European. Long history there. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa or Brazilian. This is my first time in Brazil. But that's my impression. It doesn't matter where you go, and in the Middle East. And interestingly, in most countries, the people who are the most persecuted are often the religious minorities within the dominant faith. So, for example, if you're a Shia Muslim in a majority Sunni country, you might be on the short end of persecution, or vice versa. Similarly, of course, in Europe, the history has been Christian on Christian persecution. You see this in many different places. But the point is that whoever is on the receiving end of religious persecution believes in religious freedom.
Right.
That is for sure, and it doesn't matter who you are or where you are or when you are. So to say it's a particularly Western idea, I think is ill-founded, and if people traveled a little bit more and asked people, and certainly if they saw the victims of religious violence and persecution, they would certainly find that there is a universal thirsting for religious freedom.
Could I just add to that I think the trick is that those who have been persecuted defend, when they get the opportunity, the rights of others other than their own groups to have freedom, right? That's the test, in a way. Those persecuted groups want their freedom, but do they, when they get their freedom, exercise the same protection for other people? Again and again, you see that as a problem. I would say that the Adventists, the Mormons, a number of other groups have done very well in that regard. It seems to me they have worked, and organizations and events like the one we're having are examples of that. You're not simply interested in protecting your own religious freedom, but the religious freedom of all the other groups.
But to go back to John Calvin example, the real test is when you're in charge.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And Adventists, we are big in some countries. And we have, like, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea is an Adventist, as an example. But we're not the majority in countries. The real test of your character and your principles is when you are in charge. And I think that the Calvin example is a cautionary tale for all of us.
The good thing was, though, that Roger Williams, when he took over, actually did implement a policy of general tolerance for all people.
Which is why we remember him. He's the
Indeed,
exception to the rule.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, and that made me think of, I think there's a quote by, Alan, somewhat controversial figure, but Alan Dershowitz, like the famous attorney, says, the limits of freedom is not the freedom that you give to yourself or to your friends, but the people that you hate the most. Sure. I think that's a similar principle, right? The limits of religious freedom are the test of religious freedom is not the freedom that we give to ourselves, to our own religion. It's those religions that we like, that we dislike the most, or that we feel most uncomfortable with. And James, I wanted to ask you, what does it mean for us to say, going a little bit more on a denominational route, what does it mean for us to say that Christianity cannot be lived out as private piety?
Yeah, it's a good question. That is, nearly every religious faith, and certainly Christianity, has a public component to it. And we can sort of run that down a little bit, but one of the ways that Christianity typically has served and expressed its Christianity and devotion to Christ is through ministries of healing, ministries of education, ministries of helping the poor and the destitute. Now, those are all very public things. You can't do it. Yes, Christ said, don't make a big fuss out of it, but it's kind of hard to hide that you've got a hospital, right? I mean, it's just, you either do or you don't, and so forth. And the point is that isn't just something that's done as an auxiliary to your faith. It is core to the gospel message. Sometimes I talk about the gospel as being a bird with two wings. One is salvation by grace, but the other is also loving each other like God loved us. And that includes, you know, in like Matthew 25, where Christ talks about, you know, I was hungry and you fed me, and I was destitute and you gave me a house, all those sorts of very practical things. That is our faith. And if you're not able to do that, well, you can't live out your faith.
And what is one current issue in religious liberty that we're not talking about that you think that we should be talking about?
Oh, I was going to say the Aboriginal rights problem. That seems to me a key one. At least
Yeah,
we
it
could
is.
say we haven't been talking about it as
true.
extensively as we should be. And I'm so pleased to be at an occasion like this where we are working on that. So that's at least where my own attention is right now, and I'm glad it's being shared by others.
We want to thank you both for your presence here. It was an honor to have you here. And just to finalize our participation here, I wanted to ask you, this podcast, Artificial Hearts, it's a podcast dedicated to humanizing the hearts that have become cold through secular humanism by disseminating the works of Dostoevsky to a popular audience and reinvigorating and restoring Western culture with the timeless truths and values of the Christian gospel. So in a society where the fundamental human rights of religious freedom and freedom of conscience are being constantly under attack, how do you see the work of religious freedom? How do you see the work of conferences like this in helping us and humanizing us and helping us create a better society where we can live together, coexist, and respect one another, despite our theological differences?
Well,
Go ahead.
I would say that the cause of religious freedom has become less popular over my lifetime, which maybe doesn't say much about the effect of my work, but but it's become less of a popular cause. And one of the things that I'm very encouraged by is meeting you, because you're a younger guy, but you're passionate and you're on the job and you're popularizing these ideas. And I think that we really need to reignite the passion for this among younger generations. You know, we talk a lot about social justice and some of the issues that go with that, and that's many of those issues like racial equity and so forth. These are very, very important issues, but we can't lose that religious freedom is so core to the peaceful coexistence within a diverse society, and many other fundamental building blocks of a productive and happy society to live in.
And final words?
I would just say very quickly that we are faced in the world, not just in the U.S. or in Brazil, with the rise of what's called Christian nationalism, religious nationalism, which is the very opposite of the kind of thing we're talking about. That movement would impose upon believers of all kinds religious restrictions, governmental punishments, and so on, to promote one particular point of view against a diversity of others. And therefore, at this particular time, we're really faced with the need to redouble our efforts in rising to the defense of religious liberty.
We want to thank you all. I want to thank these two gentlemen who took their time. I know James, we got him straight from the airport to come here, and we're on a really tight schedule, folks, but please stay tuned for more content. Don't forget to like us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and follow our content. And please, support this project. If you want to see more presentations like this from these phenomenal presentations that you just got here today, please continue to support our work. And thank you for staying tuned. I want to finally thank the North Brazil Union of Seventh-day Adventists President André Dantas and Heron Santana, who made this live a reality. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for more content from Artificial Hearts. Thank you very much.